قراءة في كتاب الظلم للناشط الحقوقي والكاتب ميكو بيليد. يتحدث الكتاب عن قصة الناشطين الخمسة في مؤسسة الأرض المقدسة الخيرية، يعرض مأساة سجن أولئك النشطاء في الولايات المتحدة. يرفض الكاتب فكرة معاقبة أهالي الشهداء والمعتقلين في فلسطين ومنع المساعدات عنهم. يتبنى الكاتب رؤية مفادها أن حرية أولئك النشطاء مرتبطة بحرية فلسطين.
It's a pleasure to be here in الحوار to speak about my new book, Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5 that had just come out earlier this year. The story of the Holy Land Foundation and the 5 men that are now sitting in federal prison in the United States is a remarkable saga, a tragedy really, that demonstrates the veracity and the viciousness with which Muslim Palestinians have been persecuted and prosecuted and are still being persecuted and prosecuted in the United States and in the West, largely because of pressure from Israel. The Holy Land Foundation was, until 9/11, the largest Muslim charity in America. It was vital in providing relief for Palestinians in refugee camps, be it in Palestine and be it around Palestine. They were among first responders and supporters of and providers of relief after 9/11 itself in the United States, after the Oklahoma City bombing. They provided relief during crises around the world, natural disasters, war. They provided relief for refugees. They provided relief after earthquakes, tornadoes, and floods. And over the years, they managed to develop a stellar reputation, being an honest and trustworthy relief organization. They were probably the most popular relief organization for Muslims in America. And around the early to mid-1990s, the Zionist groups within the United States began to notice them and feel a sense of concern because, unbeknownst to them and without intending to deal with politics, the Holy Land Foundation, because of their good work and because of their stellar reputation, were able to create alliances with other organizations, with other relief organizations. They were getting awards and recognitions. And they were presenting a picture of Palestine and the Palestinians, which was contrary to the picture that the Zionist watchdogs in the West would like to have presented. And so it was organizations in the United States like the Anti-Defamation League, politicians, Zionist politicians like Chuck Schumer and Anthony Weiner and others, who began to poison the public opinion regarding the Holy Land Foundation, and also to go to the authorities and start spreading rumors that somehow they were supporting terrorist organizations. They even went so far as to go to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS in the United States, to try to revoke their not-for-profit status. So this was a campaign that began in the early to mid-1990s and went all the way until the Holy Land Foundation was eventually closed down. After 9/11, the organization was closed down. It was December of 2001. Then President George Bush announced that the Holy Land Foundation was a major terrorist funding network, that they were sending money to Hamas, which by then was recognized as a terrorist organization or designated as a terrorist organization in the United States. And they were designated as a terrorist organization, closed down, and their assets were frozen. And here's where the saga becomes really incredibly interesting, and the nature of these fine men who are running the organization becomes apparent. When they were closed down by executive order by George Bush without due process, and their assets were frozen, they were not concerned. They were perfectly, they felt that this was understandable considering what had happened in the United States, that there was fear, that there was panic, and so forth. And their lawyers, whom I interviewed for the book, told me that they found this to be quite incredible. So the Holy Land Foundation sued the government, which is what you do when the government acts arbitrarily, and they assumed that everything would be fine because they did everything right. They had their taxes paid on time. Every penny that they ever raised was traceable, and you could tell exactly where it went. All the organizations with which they worked overseas, particularly in Palestine, were registered, were well known, and so forth, and had good reputations. So they were not worried. They presented their case to a judge in Washington, D.C., suing the government. The government presented their case. Holy Land Foundation's case and the file that they presented with their evidence was voluminous. I mean, they had an incredible amount of documentation demonstrating exactly what they did and how they did it right. The government had a file which was called the administrative folder, in which it tried to explain what it did, why it did what it did, and in it were newspaper articles. There were no sworn statements. Nothing was written under oath. There was some information that was sent over by the government of Israel, particularly the Israeli police, and that was it. So they were quite confident, and their lawyers were quite confident that everything was going to be fine. However, the judge dismissed the case and struck the evidence from the record, which was quite shocking. Now, this is problematic in many, many ways, but particularly because in the government's folder, where it explained why it closed the Holy Land Foundation and designated them as a terrorist organization, was a document that was sent over by the government of Israel, where the manager of their office in Jerusalem admits that some money was given to Hamas. So, of course, this is a very serious issue. His name was Muhammad Anati. The lawyers contacted Mr. Anati's lawyer in Jerusalem. And she said, I have all of his statements, I have everything, I have records of everything he said, of all of his interrogations. He said no such thing. So she had all the documents sent over to the lawyers in the United States. And mind you, all of this is taking place in the United States. She sent the documents over to the United States. The defense lawyers had everything translated, notarized, and signed under oath. And the statement that Mr. Anati gave was exactly the opposite, that Holy Land Foundation never gave any money to any organization based on political affiliation, and they never gave any money to any military organizations. So he said the exact opposite, but the file with the correct translation was struck from the evidence by the judge. The file with the wrong translation, the false translation, was admitted. As they went to appeal, the appellate court said, to appeal this decision, the appellate court said, well, perhaps under normal circumstances, this would be true. In other words, this appeal would have some merit. However, this is not a normal case. These are not normal circumstances. And because this is an issue of national security, they upheld the lower court's, the judge's decision. And that's really when the lawyers understood that their clients were not going to get a fair trial. That from that moment on, Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs in America were not going to get a fair trial. Now, this is a very serious statement to make. I've heard this from almost every single lawyer that was involved in this case, and it's quite apparent from the case itself. Moving on a little bit, the lawyers learned that the government was preparing to indict 5 of the men who were involved with the organization and begin a criminal case. And they were quite surprised because there was no crime. So what the government had done, it was obvious that they could not show that Holy Land Foundation gave money to Hamas because it didn't. So what they said was that the organizations with which Holy Land Foundation was working in Palestine were controlled by Hamas. These are the local zakat committees. And since these zakat committees were controlled by Hamas, then Hoyland Foundation is guilty of providing material support to a terrorist organization. And to that end, the government brought in enormous amounts of evidence that was confiscated, documents that were confiscated by the Israeli military in illegal searches and illegal raids into offices in Ramallah and other cities all over the West Bank, and sent over to the United States, again, poorly translated. There was no clear record of where the documents came from and who had control over them and so forth. And they sent two expert witnesses that testified anonymously, and one was a member of the Israeli secret police, the Shabak, and one was a member of the Israeli military intelligence. Now this is unprecedented, this is unconstitutional, and has never been allowed in a court of law in the United States until this trial. And still, the defense lawyers were able to show that even these so-called expert witnesses who testified anonymously had very little knowledge about the zakat committees, they had very little knowledge about anything that had to do with the work of the zakat committees, who were the members of the boards of the different committees, and so forth. The trial ended, this was the first of two trials, ended with a mistrial. There were no convictions. And this, of course, was considered a great victory, and a second trial was set. By the time the second trial came around, the government had changed the indictments, changed the charges. Initially, there were 32 charges in which all 5 men were charged. And the second time around, the second trial, they amended the charges. They did not charge all of them with the same charges. The indictment was different. And they ended the second trial with all convictions. And the judge in the second trial had allowed the same 2 anonymous witnesses to come and testify again, the same evidence and even more evidence that the first judge, who was no friend of the defense, did not allow. And there was more testimony by witnesses that the first judge, who again was no friend of the defense team, had not allowed. And of course, the second trial ended with all convictions. And upon appeal, the appellate court of the United States said, well, perhaps those pieces of evidence should not have been allowed. Perhaps these testimonies should not have been allowed. However, they were harmless. And when the lawyers pointed out that the first trial ended with no convictions, the second trial ended with all convictions, and the differences are these pieces of evidence and these particular witnesses, the appellate court came back and said they're just upholding the lower court's decision, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take the case. So the way things stand today is as follows. There are 5 innocent Muslim Palestinian Americans who are in federal prison. And I'll tell you each name and how long they are, and what they are, what kind of prison sentences they were given. Now, mind you, the prison sentences were given exactly, were handed out exactly 10 years ago. So the first one was Abdurrahman Odeh, who had really nothing to do with the running of the organization. He was a volunteer. He ran a food pantry for homeless people in Paterson, New Jersey. And very early on, the FBI, the U.S. authorities, tried to get him to work with them and to testify against the Hoyland, the members of the Hoyland Foundation. When he continuously refused over several years, he was given a warning to say that he would not be able to find work and that he was going to pay for his refusal to work with the FBI. He was not concerned, and he refused to work with them. He was given 15 years prison sentence in federal prison. And during the trial, the FBI continued to try to get him to work with them, offering him a deal whereby he would be out in 6 months. But that was going to come with a gag order. In other words, he would not be allowed to speak about the case. And he understood that this would basically mean that he would go against his friends, and he absolutely refused. They came back to him later on and offered him an even shorter sentence, and still he refused. And today he's serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison on terrorism charges. So that's a kind of remarkable person that he is. The second one is Muhammad al-Mzain. His name is Abu Ibrahim. He's the elderly of the group. He was really the spiritual inspiration behind the Holy Land Foundation. He was an imam. He is well versed in the Quran. He's a highly educated man, and he was brought into this as well. And the charges against him, of course, were false. He was given 15 years, but he dared to admit during the interrogation, without being asked or without it all being an issue, that he was a proud member of the Muslim Brothers, and that he sees nothing wrong with that. And even when I visited him in the prison, and he's sitting there in his prison clothes with guards looking at us, he looked straight at me and he said, "I'm a Muslim brother. They can never change who I am. I'm proud of who I am and what I've done." And I have to say, it's rare to see such determination and such honesty and such courage at all among people. The third one is Mufid Abdul Qadir. And Mufid Abdul Qadir, again, had nothing to do with the running of the organization. He would volunteer, he would do skits, he would sing, and he would raise funds. And after the first trial, he was actually found not guilty on all charges. But Mufid Abdul Qadir has a brother, and his brother's name is Khalid Mash'al. And he was dragged into this and became part of the indictment, obviously, because of that. And even though when the trial began, in his opening statements, the prosecutor said that family connections should not be a reason to convict, the prosecution brought expert witnesses again who testified that in terrorism cases, family connections are very important, and hinting, of course, at the case of Mufid Abdul Qadir. He was found not guilty on all charges after the first trial, but when the jury was polled by the prosecution, one of the members of the jury decided she changed her mind and said, no, I changed my mind. And immediately the judge called a mistrial on him, and he is now serving a 20-year sentence in federal prison. The fourth one I'll tell you about is Ghassan Elashi. Ghassan Elashi is one of two who received a 65-year prison sentence. And he was an unpaid president of the organization. And he did a great deal of important work in running of the organization. I was not able to visit him. He's the only one of the five I was not able to visit in prison. And finally, Shukri Abu Bakr, who was really the engine that ran the organization. And he's also serving 65 years in federal prison. And again, in the opening statement of the prosecution, the prosecutor said that Holy Land Foundation was established in 1987, Hamas was established in 1987, so obviously there's a connection between the two. Of course, there are many other things that happened in 1987, two of which were very important in this particular case, and the prosecution left out. The first one is that in 1987, the first Palestinian Intifada broke out, and there was a great need for relief in Palestine. There were closures, there was lack of food, there were many injured, and of course there were prisoners and families of prisoners who needed help. And the other thing that happened was that Shukri's daughter Sanabil was born that year, and she was born with several life-threatening diseases, and they had to avail themselves of the help of relief hospitals, and he was exposed for the first time to the world of relief organization, charitable organizations, hospitals, and so forth. And he made up his mind that he wanted to make this sort of service, this wonderful service that his daughter was able to enjoy, available to Palestinians. And that was what drove him to start this work. And I dedicate the book to the memory of Sanabil, Shukri's daughter. Now, what's incredibly interesting about this case is the way the prosecution built it. They brought in expert witnesses who said the following: not only did the Holy Land Foundation, by helping orphans and poor people in Palestine support terrorism, they in fact encouraged terrorism. Because if they were helping orphans, then they were encouraging Palestinians to go out and become suicide attackers and to go out and become terrorists. Because if anybody knows that their families, their orphans will be taken care of, will be given a stipend of $50 or $100 per month, they're of course going to volunteer to commit acts of terrorism. And the same thing they said regarding the help that the Hoyland Foundation provided for the families of prisoners. They said, well, these prisoners are obviously terrorists, otherwise they wouldn't be in prison, and if by helping them, they are not only supporting terrorism, but they are encouraging terrorism. Of course, we know even today that this is a serious problem, and a great deal of money is being denied to Palestinian prisoners because of this assumption that the Palestinian prisoners are terrorists, and Israel is insisting that the money that goes to support their families will stop. What they're leaving out, they left out in the trial, and what of course people leaving out today in this issue of the prisoners, is that the vast majority of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons are not terrorists, they're political prisoners. According to Israeli sources, even, the vast majority of the prisoners held by Israel have never been charged with any acts of violence. These are all political prisoners. And of course we know that there are many women and even children that are being held. But in this case, what's important is that the breadwinner is unable to provide for his family and the family needs support. And therefore exists this support system which helps the families survive while their breadwinner is held in prison. So the case today stands really at a deadlock. I mean, the United States Supreme Court would not hear the case. Like I said, President Obama, upon leaving office, was petitioned to commute their sentence and deport them. There were several governments who were quite happy to receive them and give them citizenship, who wouldn't. These are some of the finest men I have ever met and anybody will ever meet. Not only are they innocent, but they are fine, caring, hardworking, very devout believers, and very, very fine men. But President Obama refused to commute their sentences. I believe that they are, and they believe this too, they are political prisoners, just like Palestinian political prisoners sit in Israeli jails, just that they're sitting in prison in America. And they understand this fully too. And their fate is connected to the fate of not only Palestinian prisoners, but also Palestine in general. And the fact that Palestine is occupied, all of Palestine, from the river to the sea, and has been occupied for 7 decades. The fact that Palestinians have been living under this brutal regime of apartheid for 7 decades. The fact that Palestinians are unable to express their freedoms and live free, whether it's in Gaza or it's in the Negev Desert or it's in Jerusalem or anywhere else. This is entirely the same story. So the personal story of these 5 men, the story of the judicial system and how it operated in this particular case, and the story of Palestine at large, and the relations between Israel and the United States all play into this particular story, which was why it was very difficult to actually write this book, because to take all of these 3 circles and to put them into one narrative and to put them into one sentence, into one story, and to make sense of it all was quite challenging. I'm very, very happy that I was able to do this. The prisoners have all, the 5 men have all received their copies of this book. And they thankfully appreciated and said good things about it, so I'm very grateful for that. I read thousands and thousands of pages of court documents, many of which I put in the book so people would see just what a terrible miscarriage of justice this was, how corrupt the judicial system and unfair and unjust the judicial system was in this particular case towards these men. And this is a story that continues not only for them, but now it's much easier for the United States to prosecute young and older Palestinian and Muslims in general and put them in prison and give them very long prison sentences. And the only way that we can do anything about this, the only way this can change, is if we get up and act, which is why I wear the BDS button, the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel, because this is the connection. Until Israel is placed in the position where it must yield, where it must end the apartheid regime, or it must release the political prisoners that it holds, nothing will change in the lives of these particular men either. It is all connected. And once Palestine is free, and once political prisoners, Palestinian prisoners are free, then there will inevitably be a chain reaction, and I believe that these men will be free as well. It seems like a daunting task, and perhaps it is a daunting task, but I believe that it's one that we're all up to, and I believe that it's a task that we are all, that we have a responsibility to take part in. And so I would encourage everybody to take a look at the book, read the story, read about these fine men, and do everything we can to help them. Thank you very much.